Gachas pose a threat to players because they're extremely addictive and drain pockets quickly. But how do these gachas work? And why are they so successful in extracting millions from their players every year? The answer seems as simple as the player's choice, but evidence shows that these games may be neurologically overriding our reward systems, making it hard to make a clear-headed decision. Furthermore, animal studies show that this manipulation may go deeper than the human brain, and that gachas may manipulate systems that have been around before human existence. While originally just a joke genre, gachas have been making huge waves in the world recently, even winning some major gaming awards. With the name gacha coming from the Japanese word gachapan, which basically means like those little toy vending machines that you get at Walmart, gacha games similarly work on a randomized loot box system.
And the fun is that you never know what you're gonna get. It's a mystery.
You never know what you're gonna get.
The loot boxes usually give rewards in the form of characters or items that help you progress through the game. These boxes are rarely given and are usually bought with in-game currency that players can either grind or pay to obtain. This paid option is the crux on which the gacha industry stands, and many players often fall into the trap of payment. Interestingly, although spending in gachas is a common experience for players, actually being happy after spending is not.
$30 for a pull?
This phenomenon has been called the gacha grief cycle before, and is a common experience that most gacha players relate to. Here's how my rendition of it goes. Stage 1, excitement. The game advertises new extremely rare characters, and players want them. Stage 2, debate. Players want the new items, but realize their best chance of actually getting them is by paying for pulls. They then start to have an internal dialogue over if it's actually worth it to buy or not. Stage 3, succumbence. The little devil on their shoulder wins, and they decide to buy some pulls, usually going for the promotional value deal the game released with the new character. Stage 4, result. Players then take their chances at the lottery, and the resulting moods of players mirror the odds in the poll. Most players are unhappy, a decent amount are okay with it, and only a very small amount of people who paid are actually happy with what they got. You see, when gacha players pay for pulls, in their mind they're paying for the best possible outcome, but in reality that's the least likely thing to happen. This leads players into being disappointed with what they got, even though they got exactly what they paid for, a chance at the top. Although very rare, every so often a player does get lucky and gets that ultra rare character. But even when they do this, it's only a short-lived success, as gachas often replace their current characters with new, more powerful characters. No matter how you look at it, gachas set us up for failure. They always supply us with new things to chase just to move the goalposts whenever we get close to obtaining it. What's interesting is the very things that create the lack of possible satisfaction are exactly what motivates us to play the game more. When we decide to play a gacha, we know we're subjecting ourselves to an endless chase in which we'll never reach the end. Additionally, we know we're probably going to lose money in the process. But why do we even do this? I mean, what kind of masochistic shit is that? What makes us even bother with playing gachas? Well, first, to truly understand gachas, we need to change our question from why do we play it to how does it play us? You see, gachas have an uncanny ability to create players who compulsively play their game without even having fun. And when you ask these players, well, what's the point of playing it if you don't even enjoy it? They usually say something along the lines of, well, if I don't play right now, I'm going to miss out on these rewards. This is a clear sign of manipulation. And through these false senses of urgency the game gives us, we can start to see how exactly it manipulates us. But to truly understand, we need to break gachas down piece by piece and understand their structural similarities. In so, we can begin to understand their plan and how exactly they go about manipulating their players. The anatomy of a gacha. Pulls. Anime gambling. Pulls are at the heart and soul of every gacha, as they're the defining feature of the genre itself. The pull system in gachas give players a chance at getting characters of different rarities, and usually these rarities correlate with their effectiveness in game as well. You know, a common unit is usually the least powerful, and the uber legendary God Mode, Pro Max, Ultra Instinct ones are the best. In almost all gachas, pulls can be obtained by either grinding the game, paying with in-game currency, or paying with real money. In addition, almost every game has an animation or some sort of indicator that signifies the quality of the pull right after you open it, but right before you actually see your characters. These signifiers that you see before actually getting the reward are super manipulative, but we'll touch a little bit more on that later. In most cases, though, pulls are given to players at a high rate during the start of the game, and this high frequency of reward gets them used to pulling often. But as a player progresses through the game, pulls become increasingly hard to obtain, leaving them with a sense of craving the rewards they once had. On top of craving, pulls give the brain what's called a variable reward ratio that elicits dopamine in simply just the anticipation of a reward. Since your body's sending off reward signals to just the anticipation or just the act of opening a pack, your body may be interpreting pulls as a reward in and of themselves, which can lead to almost a pull addiction rather than actually an addiction to getting good rewards. That can help explain why some people at slot machines might just be spamming the button without even caring what they get because they have a pull addiction. But it's just an idea and nothing's confirmed. Competition, the motor of the gacha. Most gachas depend on players buying pulls or making in-game purchases, but to get their players to even do this, there has to first be a want to do this. And gacha games almost always foster this artificial sense of want through competition. In gachas, competition takes place in the form of either player versus player ranked modes or boss battles in which a player has to defeat an NPC. Defeating these opponents will give a player a reward, and obviously the harder the opponent you defeat, the better rewards you get. Since players typically want the most rewards possible, they naturally want to defeat the highest ranking competition. But, obviously beating the hardest competition isn't easy. And in these games, it almost requires you to have the best resources available. But these most powerful characters are extremely rare and usually only have a pull rate of about 1 to 3% depending on the gacha. Since there's such a low pull rate, the only chance players have at realistically getting these items is by just increasing the number of pulls they do. Additionally, sometimes gachas use iconic or famous characters to also incentivize a player to make them want to buy. For example, if someone's favorite Pokemon is Charizard and Pokemon TCG Pocket comes out with a new awesome Charizard card that's also the strongest in the game, this player now has 2 reasons to get as many pulls as possible. Power creep. Your god tier character from 2 months ago? Yeah, they're mid now. Power creep is when gachas regularly refresh their crates with new and improved characters. The rate of these refreshers vary game to game, but it's usually at a fairly rapid pace. What's consistent among all these games, though, is that the new players replace the current ones as the best in the game. Power creeps can help explain why players feel like they have to keep playing, as they're constantly trying to stay up to date in order to not miss any new drops. Missing a few of these drops can realistically take your once amazing team to now an okay team, effectively just destroying all the progress you made in the past. Power creeps are used to keep the game from feeling stale while also upkeeping the want for players to get more pulls. But what's interesting to me is that these new characters essentially just restart the game. What I mean by that is even if you really got lucky in the last phase and pulled the super ultra rare, it doesn't matter because they're just going to be replaced by a new and better character in a couple weeks. For this reason, you can't really ever win in pulls. Rather, you can only simply buy yourself some time before you have to pull again. And that's why, lucky or not, players are always in this endless cycle of pulls. Multiple currencies. How much is a pull worth? A lot of gachas will carry multiple currencies, with the main 2 being an in-game currency that you can grind to obtain, and a premium currency that's only available through payment. In the 2 games I play, College Football Ultimate Team and Pokemon Pocket, this shows up as coins and points in college football and hourglasses and gold in Pokemon. The manipulative purpose of having multiple currencies isn't necessarily intuitive, and you may be thinking, well, why is it advantageous for these companies to even have this? But the trick is simple. Essentially, having 2 currencies allows us to make comparisons between the currencies and therefore put a value on each one. For example, in Pokemon, a 10 pull is worth 120 hourglasses and 60 gold. It having multiple currencies to buy the actual 10 pull is important because it allows us to attribute a sense of value to each currency individually. And with this, they're able to convince us that we're getting a bargain when we buy their special limited time deal. For example, you may have noticed that since a 10 pull is 120 hourglasses and only 60 gold, that 1 gold equals the value of 2 hourglasses. If for some reason Pokemon decided to come out with a new improved pack that costs 170 hourglasses for a 10 pull, but only 50 in gold for that same 10 pull, we would flock to this and assess it as such a steal. We'd be like, oh my god, we're getting this amazing 10 pull for cheap. But is it really such a bargain? I mean, since digital content can can be arbitrarily priced and we really have nothing to compare it to since each gacha game has their own currency and payment for currencies. There's no hard evidence to say that the original prices of things in games actually correlate with their real value. Therefore, a game could specifically overprice their pulls during normal phases in order to draw more attention to their special deal ultra limited time rare value pull, which indeed are priced lower than the normal pull, but maybe at the price they actually want people to buy stuff at. For example, this is kind of similar to what Kohl's does, in which they mark up literally everything in their store just to then say every single thing in their store is also on sale to trick their customers into thinking that they're getting some amazing deal, when in reality, they're just buying clothes at the price that Kohl's is happy with. It's like if oranges were worth $1, and then I made an orange stand and said all these oranges are worth $5, but today they're on sale for $1.50. People would think, oh my god, what a steal on oranges, I gotta buy this right now. But in reality, you're just paying the same exact price you would pay if I just priced it normally. As in the oranges example I just gave, most of the time gachas pair these value deals with a limited amount of time, creating a sense of FOMO and urgency in the player, which also happens to be our next section, FOMO, fear of missing out. Many gachas employ FOMO to create a sense of urgency and need for players to buy their packs now. As I just stated, the multiple currencies also help to intensify this effect, but FOMO is a powerful tool in and of itself. EA's College Football and Madden Ultimate Team are really good at using this FOMO, as both of these games drop around 4 to 8 limited time new best cards in the game every single week. They drop them every week because they're only in packs for that week, meaning that if they drop a character you really like, you only have a week to get them. The limited time aspect of these characters also make them seem inherently more valuable to the player, as it's kind of cool to have something that won't ever come back again. However, the main selling point is still that they're the best in the game. And since they drop weekly, it creates a reoccurring sense of want and need to get them right now in all their players, especially the players who really care about competing at the highest level. What's funny is, in gachas, there's a trend that the players who want to be the best are also manipulated the most and happen to fall victim to most of Gacha's tricks. These players are called meta slaves, and they'll be the first topic in our next section, the human aspect of Gacha anatomy. Much like how we can point to the manipulative infrastructure of Gachas, we can also point to behavioral consistencies among players that make these Gacha games possible. Gachas are a unique genre of game in this regard, as their players fall into consistent archetypes that shape the game and how it manages its marketing. Meta slave. The meta slave is the most fundamental type of player driving gachas. Meta slaves are people who must compete, and they must do everything they can to get the best items or characters available. These players are the ones who will complete all the missions and challenges the game offers in order to maximize the rewards and therefore maximize their pulls and chances of getting the best players. And it's these players who see the true value in making in-app purchases. For example, buying an in-game currency for $5 that would normally take you about 3 hours of grinding to get seems a lot more enticing to the players who care so much about rewards and have already spent countless hours grinding away at a game than a player who could care less about what they get and just plays casually. In my experience, meta slaves tend to view themselves as the best and true players of the game because of their high rank and flashy lineups. But in reality, these players are the saddest of them all. These players get manipulated by gachas left and right and are doomed to never being satisfied, as they're always chasing the top that's literally unattainable. Or, for longer than 2 weeks at least. In contrast, I've seen that the casual and less good players are the only ones who are actually able to enjoy the game in totality, as they escaped the rat race that gachas try to sell you. No matter how you look at it, gachas are always just using tactics to pull a competitive player into the paid option. And they want to foster players who care about winning because they want to foster players who are going to be likely to buy their items. Getting all the best characters and items in a game is no cheap task, and be it time or money, you're going to pay greatly in one way or another. Although meta slaves are usually the ones who do pay, some players are willing to spend more than others, and then some players are willing to spend even more than that. We all have our own unique patterns when it comes to spending in gachas, but for simplicity, the community has set up 3 main archetypes of spenders: whales, dolphins, and minnows. Whales, dolphins, and minnows describe 3 forms of spenders in the gacha sphere. Whales are the giant spenders who, to put it frankly, have some of the most ludicrous and non-logical instances of spending I've ever seen in my life. For example, a few years ago, a Fate Grand Order player went viral for having spent over $70,000 on that game alone. Additionally, I've seen clips where streamers like Lucari and Tectone have claimed to have spent $50,000 on gachas and an insane $500,000 on Genshin Impact alone. In contrast to the whales, dolphins and minnows are just moderate to light spenders. Minnows are typically players who drop small amounts of money at a time, usually $5 here and $5 there, and dolphins are just that, but at a larger scale. Taking from the deepest depths of Reddit knowledge, minnows usually spend $1 to $100, dolphins usually spend $100 to $500, and whales usually spend $1,000 plus. In the Reddit forum, they never explained if this was monthly, yearly, or any sort of frequency, but you kind of get the picture. Now that we've observed the core methods found in gachas, we have a better understanding of their manipulative architecture. But the question still remains, why did these work? And why is it possible for humans, the smartest creatures on Earth, to drop thousands and thousands every year on stuff that literally isn't real? Well, as most behavioral questions are, there's a plethora of answers and possibilities that could account for this, and it requires both a macro and micro scientific approach. In this video, we'll look into both, but to start, let's go big picture. Evolution. Where we come from matters. Challenges that our ancestors faced long ago largely shape how we react to things in the modern day. Therefore, it's important to investigate evolutionary history to gain some insight into modern behavioral issues. We share many similarities with our animal counterparts that not only show our relation, but also suggest that we can reliably use other animals in order to get insight into how we act. For example, in my field, we're able to study rat and mouse brains to get insight into human brains. We can do this because our brains are similar and we share a lot of the same systems, such as the melanocortin system, mesocortical limbic dopamine system, and the HPA axis, among others. It's for these reasons that scientists are able to take results from tests on mice and rats and see them as legitimate insight into humans. The results from these studies end up being the building blocks on which modern medicine and other forms of treatment are made. When looking for studies that could help us gain insight into why humans gamble, a study that stuck out to me was one that utilized pigeons. In this study, researchers set up pigeons in an operant box under a two-choice paradigm. The box looks like this, and when put in the box, pigeons were able to choose between two lines. Line 1 had an outcome that would produce a blue light 20% of the time, and a yellow light 80% of the time. But no matter what light came on, they would always get 3 pellets dropped in their cage. However, when the pigeons would peck line 2, a green light was shown 20% of the time, and a red light was shown 80% of the time. But in this case, when a green light was shown that 20% of the time, 10 pellets were dropped in their cage. And 80% of the time when that red line was shown, they would get no pellets. Meaning that if they hit a green, that's basically like a jackpot, earning them more pellets than the safe, secure option of just getting 3. Doing the math on these options, we see that line 1 gives you 3 pellets per press, obviously, and line 2 only gives you about 2 pellets per press, making line 1 the optimal answer. Before getting into the results, let's take a prediction on this. What do you think the pigeons chose most of the time? Optimal foraging theory would suggest that pigeons would press line 1 because it yields the most food, but shockingly, the pigeons significantly preferred line 2 and they went for it about 82.2% of the time. From this, we can see that animals and probably humans too can't really trust our intuition to make the best and most rational decisions. I mean, if it was just as simple as this lever is 3 and this lever is 2 straight up, every animal would just press that first lever over and over again. But it seems that the variable reinforcement schedule that comes with this gambling kind of muddies the water for our brain and makes it hard to tell what's actually the best, which one you're actually getting value out of. This sort of muddying the water seems to leave us vulnerable and ripe for manipulation, which I'm sure gachas are aware of. Taking it a step deeper, this study also tested more pigeons under different conditions. It was relatively the same experiment, but this time researchers wanted to know if it was simply the variability that was creating the confusion and not something else happening. So in this second rendition of the experiment, they kept the function of line 1 and 2 the same, as line 1 was 3 every time and line 2 was 10 only 20% of the time. However, this time researchers neutralized the colors that would show after pigeons made a choice in order to make them non-predictive of rewards. To paint the picture more clearly, in both experiments, when a pigeon picks either line, it would get a light. In both experiments, whenever a pigeon presses their line, they get a light that shows up before receiving their reward. But the difference is that lights were attached to meaning in the first one. Remember that in line 2, red equals no pellets and green equals 10. These predictive light cues may have affected the pigeon's decision making and made them want to interact further with line 2 despite it being risky and yielding less pellets over time anyways. Because of this possible confounding variable, researchers wanted to isolate the variable ratio schedule and make sure that this was the only thing causing confusion. But after testing the pigeons in the second condition, Their preference flipped, and now it went to the smart decision, line 1. So what's happening here? And what can we even take from this? Well, from my interpretation, I think in the first experiment, pigeons made an association between the colors in the risky condition in a way that learned that red equals 0, green equals 10, and that also enough reds would probably equal a green eventually. This is similar to the gambler's fallacy, where gamblers feel like they're due for a win after taking so many losses. In other words, just like gamblers, I think that the pigeon's internal structure may have communicated a signal that said, man, I can't get reds forever, so let me just go till I get a green. However, when tested in the second condition, since there was no predictive signal, the pigeons may not have been able to make this same association and rather viewed the second line as just random and risky. They weren't able to attach a rhyme or reason as to why they were getting the result that was happening in the line 2. So they just said, oh, well, line 1's way smarter. Let me just keep going with that. I don't know what's going to happen in line 2. But how does this add to our understanding of gacha games? Well, I see the predictive lights in these cages as synonymous to the little animations that we get before we get our results in gachas, but right after we make our pull. I think these animations, similar to what may be going on with the pigeons, make us add a rhyme or reason to what's happening in packs and make us feel like eventually we're going to win. So we just have to keep on going because the game owes it to us. Additionally, it still seems that the variable reinforcement schedule may be muddying the water for our brains and making it hard to accurately assess the value of a pack. And when we add this with us thinking that packs owe us something or that something is going to happen with packs, it can lead us to thinking they're a lot more profitable or valuable than they really are. But despite these instances of animals gambling, it still doesn't explain why humans so readily buy stuff that isn't even real. I mean, it makes sense for these pigeons to be motivated by food because it's food, but do you think these pigeons would buy a 10 pull in Genshin? I mean, obviously not. So what's so special about humans? What makes us able to do this? Well, it's hard to say what exactly creates the difference and if there's even one, but what's definitely true about humans is we are able to attribute value to abstract things. Think about money, for example. In a way, this is similar to the sense of value we put on these gacha characters or items. As we know, both of these things aren't really inherently valuable, but money can be traded in to get us things which then can make us feel happy. And gacha characters and items can be used to win games, which would also make us happy. What's interesting is this may not even be a purely human ability, as animals, and especially monkeys in tourist areas, tend to steal things until something is exchanged to give it back to humans. And it could be argued that these monkeys now place abstract value on people's purses or cash because they know they can later turn that into food or some sort of fruit that they get from people on the street. But, they could also just be learning this by positive reinforcement, which would be a completely different thing. Another thing that could possibly explain why we value fake things is that we didn't really evolve to account for screens in the first place. For example, in nature, anything we put value on, even things we put abstract value on, would have been right in front of our face and therefore super relevant to our survival. In other words, our brain had no reason to even try to put in systems to distinguish between real and fake things. However, in such a short amount of time, screens have taken over the world, and they now leave us in a spot where we've evolved for one environment but are forced to live in another, which renders us more open for possible dangers that we couldn't have accounted for in evolution. To support this, neurological evidence has been found that mice are able to fire place cells, neurons that help you navigate places and remember where you are, in VR as if it was real life. In fact, these mice were able to make specific neurological connections to different places within their VR map, despite them being stationary in the real world. I mean, it's all very interesting, but it still doesn't explain what's going on inside of our brains that make us want to play gachas over and over again. And to investigate this, we need to dive into neuroscience. To enter the sphere of neuroscience with any psychological topic is kind of like opening Pandora's box. The brain is widely considered to be the most complex thing in the universe. It's for this reason that I might not touch on every single thing that could be said about this topic. Intro to dopamine. Dopamine is and probably will always be at the heart of all addictive matters. In the present day, behavioral scientists have come to view dopamine as something that plays a very important role in compelling beings into doing things. Most famously, dopamine is attributed to addictive motivation, but did you know it can actually be applied to the motivation behind almost all voluntary behaviors in general? This was shown in a study where dopamine knockouts resulted in rats not being able to move. Instead, they would just lay down and starve. At normal levels, dopamine keeps everything intact, but once you bump into something rewarding, think a good meal, money, or even someone you find attractive, the levels start to rise. The more you look into it, it seems that dopamine, in a natural sense, only really responds to good things. For example, it's things like exercise, food, reproducing, and exploration that will rise your natural levels of dopamine. Given the nature of things that actually give you a dopamine response, it makes sense that our body might evolve to view it as an indicator of, oh, I should interact with this thing more because it's good for me. But instead, we've come to view it as a bad thing because of its interaction with addictive things like drugs and games. And although drugs are inherently a bad thing when abused, I don't think your body thinks this way. I think that since addictive drugs artificially result in an increase of dopamine, the drugs themselves could possibly be tricking your body into thinking that whatever this is must be a net good thing for me, since historically this may have been the case. As said before, video games also can elicit dopamine, so games may also have this proposed effect of tricking your body into it being a good thing for you. What's funny to me is this proposal of your body not being able to tell good from bad is similar to the examples we mentioned before, where the mice couldn't tell real from fake, and the pigeons couldn't tell right from wrong. And it's kind of funny how the more we look into gachas, from all angles, it's just tricking us. Reward and cue tracking. Perhaps one of the most interesting things about gacha games is the player's focus on getting the character instead of actually getting a win. Most of the time we spend in gachas are spent trying to obtain characters. In fact, we often make our entire goals in this game centered around obtaining specific amazing characters. And what's funny is the game is set up in this way as well. The point of the game is to play, not to win. For example, we grind so hard to get to the top in order to get the greatest rewards. But the greatest rewards can only get us players that are already available in the game. And to get to the top, you would have already had to have had these players. You get what I'm saying here? No matter what in gachas, you're just playing the game to play the game more in the future. These aren't games like Mario where we play to defeat the final boss and then be happy at the end of the day. I think this concept was best exemplified in South Park in this scene. Wait, what do we do now? What do you mean? Now we can finally play the game. Oh, right. The Zone. The gacha video by, I don't know how to say this guy's name, also describes a similar phenomenon where players play the game simply to play instead of trying to win. In their video, they refer to this as the Zone. And to exemplify the Zone, they decided to use a clip of slot machine players mindlessly hacking away at the polls instead of actually checking to see if they won. This example and the whole concept of the Zone really makes me think. And I wonder if the players are actually consciously playing to play, or if something in their body is just compelling them to play. To better paint the picture, I'll use an example from neuroscience. Back in the day when, silly ethics didn't really exist, there was a few studies that implanted electrodes into dopamine-releasing areas of patients' brains. These electrodes were implanted with the intent of improving the patient's life. Also, if you don't know, electrodes are essentially these devices that, when turned on, activate the part of the brain they're attached to. When the patients had these electrodes implanted, they were also given a mode of self-stimulation. The idea was that they could stimulate this part of the brain whenever they wanted to help them feel better. However, these patients ended up becoming obsessed with their electrodes. One patient in particular, B19, stimulated the electrode 1,500 times in just a 3-hour session. That's about 8.3 times per minute for 3 hours straight. Additionally, he would protest whenever his mode of self-stimulation was taken away. Another patient with a similar electrode would press her self-stimulation mode throughout the entire day, even ignoring personal hygiene and family commitments in order to stimulate herself more. To me, these two examples remind me of the Zone, and personally, the Zone just seems to be a dopamine response. Another interesting thing is that in this person's video, they also mention a book which quotes that the goal of gachas is to keep players playing forever. So essentially, in a way, they want to get you as close as the reaction seen by B19 and this other woman as possible. I mean, they might not be using them as references, but it doesn't take away from the fact that gacha games still use tricks that revolve around manipulating the same neurotransmitters and modulators that were largely affected during the patient's experiences. Another thing that's notable about this phenomenon of signal tracking, or not really wanting to get the reward but the thing that predicts rewards, is that this is a very prominent part of the incentive sensitization theory of addiction. Funny enough, this is the same addiction model that I've chosen to help bring all these concepts we've been talking about together. An addiction model for gachas. Since I'm kind of proposing the incentive sensitization theory of addiction for gachas, it's important that I first explain how the theory works. And I'll do this with an example of a possible instance of cocaine addiction. Imagine this scenario. An otherwise normal man decides to use cocaine one day. After using the drug, he experiences the feelings that come with it, while his dopamine levels spike and sensitize his reward systems to the cues surrounding his experience. These cues include, but are not limited to, the surrounding objects, feelings, and even thoughts going on in his brain at that moment. In practice, this is his brain reinforcing and associating everything that surrounded the experience with the drug itself. A few days later, that man sees a woman walking in a blue hat. This immediately triggers a cue within his brain from his past drug use, as he was wearing a similar blue hat when he decided to snort that powder. Because of his sensitization to cues, this cue triggers a sense of craving and want for that drug again. In response, he decides to go buy and take cocaine later that night. As a result, from him using it again, his brain makes more cues and reinforces the old ones that stayed consistent between the two experiences. Thus, he now has more things and some stronger things that can trigger a cocaine wanting in his brain. Over time, he goes through this cycle over and over again, with dopamine now also spiking at the presence of the cues itself. With cues becoming stronger over time and growing in number, escaping the cravings of wanting to take that drug become extremely difficult. In fact, at some point he wants to stop, but since liking and wanting are separate in the body, which we talked about in the last video, his brain will still crave cocaine despite him consciously not really wanting to take it anymore, even if he doesn't find the experience enjoyable. Even if he does successfully quit one day, the cues will always have an influence on him, and when triggered will remind his brain of that cocaine, which can result in relapsing later on. Essentially, dopamine-inducing rewards can make your motivational system crave that reward again. These cravings can also be attached to cues that predict that reward is going to come later on. As you interact with that reward repeatedly, the reoccurring cues become strengthened while novel cues are also being made. This want is a deep neurological response and persists even if the person doesn't really want to take the drug anymore. Additionally, these cues last and can be influential even when a person does quit, which a later on strong cue triggering may result in relapse. Okay, now let's take the same example and switch it up to incorporate our ideas from gacha games. An otherwise normal man decides to play a gacha one day. While playing the game, he gets a free 10 pull and pulls a rare character. While doing the pull, his dopamine levels spike in response to the anticipation of the reward and the reward itself. Resultingly, his reward systems become sensitized to the cues surrounding the pull, including in-game elements, the environment he's in, and his phone itself. A few days later, he sees a woman holding her phone horizontally, which triggers a cue in his brain that made an association between the orientation of the phone and gacha pulling. He opens his phone immediately and completes a couple missions in order to earn a pull in the game. As before, this creates new cues associated with polling while also strengthening some of the old ones. One day on his phone, he gets a notification from that gacha saying that they have a new limited time ultra rare character. The notification, sense of limited time, and all the cues that are now getting triggered that were made in association to the game cause him to immediately click on the notification and open the game up. In fact, because his cues are now triggered, he's already entering the game with a slight crave of wanting pulls. Upon entering the game, he sees a special deal. The 10 pull is half off for 2 hours in the paid currency. Remembering the luck he had with his last 10 pull, he decides to buy this value deal. After buying, he immediately opens the pulls, and his dopamine levels go up in anticipation to the rewards, creating and reinforcing cues once again. Immediately after opening his pack, he gets the animation that signifies whether the pack is going to be good or bad. It's not the best, but it's the okay animation. He's slightly disheartened by not getting the character he wanted, but now he's invested too much to simply stop chasing it now. Additionally, the player is going to be gone soon, so he better act right now. He quickly starts grinding away at the game to earn more pulls, getting his dopamine triggered along the way itself by playing the game, and actively increasing his want to both play the game and do pulls in the game. At this point, the game has him right where they want him, playing to pull instead of playing for his own enjoyment. On top of this, he's being motivated to play because of his loss instead of being deterred by it. The player will repeat this process over and over again, while the game will continue to profit off of his time spent playing the game and accumulating money that he spends in the game over and over. End. In essence, gachas do everything they can to get us to compulsively play the game for long and spend absurd amounts of money. They do this by employing psychological tricks that create a sense of urgency while also manipulating our natural reward systems. To top it off, gachas also assert false senses of value while simultaneously throwing off our natural abilities to evaluate the worth of things, putting us in the best possible position ever to be manipulated. Gacha games may be fun, but it's important to realize their tricks so we don't end up becoming whales spending thousands and thousands on seriously nothing, and not only nothing, but a nothing that will be worth even less than nothing in a couple months. Personally, I enjoy gacha games and I'll probably won't ever stop playing. I'm sure you may be the same, but let's both agree to think twice before spending.